Topics for this week's CoreGap report. In the Terra Incognita essay, we look at the question of democracies arriving prematurely, before the middle class gets fully developed, the issue raised by Egypt. Among the strategic developments we're tracking, we look at the copycat firewalling that's going on in Syria, Yemen, and Jordan in response to what Mubarak did in Egypt, trying to hold on to his power for as long as possible, ensuring some level of smooth transition. We look at Asia's development as a banking sector and its movement outward, looking for bottom-feeding opportunities in the West, looking to establish retail networks across the gap, all part of its effort to liberalize its banking and financial sectors. We look at the food price issue, the declaration coming out of a UK study that the era of cheap food is over, and we examine the challenges there. We also look at the Moscow terror blast and raise the security issues stemming from that with regard to the Sochi Winter Olympics in 2014 and, of course, the World Cup in 2018 in Moscow, where the blast occurred. In terms of the 6 degrees of integration, we looked at China's decision to invest upwards of $10 billion in Zimbabwe. We look at the impulse coming out of the Davos conference to resurrect the Doha development round in the WTO. We look at the possibility of the U.S. exporting natural gas in the very near term, quite a surprise. We look at the recent estimates that the cleanup and recovery from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico is going to be much faster, much more comprehensive than previously anticipated. We look at Al Jazeera's fascinating rise as reflected in its non-stop and widely watched coverage of the events in Tunisia, North Africa in general, Egypt in particular. And we look at the recent report that cites that Pakistan now has more nuclear strategic weapons than India, and what that means for that tense standoff. In terms of the Terra Incognita essay, we look at the age-old problem that the United States and the West in general has faced when it's confronted with the choice of standing by the dictator that they've long supported and who has long supported their interests in the region, or moving in a risky fashion towards democracy prematurely. Obviously, it's always better to wait for a middle class to expand and to age because those characteristics tend to be associated with successful democracies. But the sad truth, or the glad truth, is that globalization is moving into the Middle East at a rather rapid speed. So it seems like we're headed for a wave of premature democracies, whether we want it or not. And even if it ends only in Egypt, which of course is going to have such a seminal kind of lead goose impact on further developments down the road. So even if this is only just a revolution in Egypt at this point and the wave stops there, we're looking at a huge nation building job where the key attribute, Wikistrat would argue, is that the West is not in charge. Again, the integrating impulse, as we've noted many times, coming from the East now, not from the West. So the opportunity and the challenge here is really to come up with a new model of nation building, one that is less resource intensive and one that moves much more swiftly than, for example, the United States did in Iraq. In terms of the issue of rising global food prices, which seems to be a major driver in the unrest that we're tracking now in North Africa. Interesting study coming out of the UK arguing that the era of cheap food globally is over. We're looking at a population increase of about 50% by 2050. Demand, according to the UN, goes up by as much as 70%. This report argues that we're looking at price increases over the next 40 years, anywhere between 50 and 100%. Now, there's a bit of a Malthusian assumption going on here. There's an assumption that productivity can't keep up with the demand. And what we'd like to point out at Wikistrat is Asia's driving this process and creating a certain amount of instability across the gap because of its rising caloric demand. It's eating a lot more beef, it's eating a lot more dairy. That creates incredible pressures, and certain grains, diverts certain grains to that kind of effort, raises the price of bread generally all across the world. So this is very much a Western Hemisphere and Northern answer long-term to rising Asia's increased caloric demand as the middle class continues to emerge there. But the assumptions about, the Malthusian assumptions about not being able to keep up with production, we'd like to point out corn production in the U.S. alone has doubled in the last 40 years. Same amount of land being used. Expectations that it can double again in the next 20 years, if you can believe it. So obviously a big push for genetically modified organisms, and you're going to see a lot of investment, a lot of consolidation, a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the food industry globally. Earlier in January, we saw the first big terrorist attack in a while in Russia. It occurred at Moscow's busiest airport. It kind of followed the pattern that we've seen before from the North Caucasus insurgents and terror network there, basically targeting mass transit depots. But the first time again for about 10 months, and really coming at a time when Moscow is trying to send off the image to the rest of the world that it's once again open for business, foreign direct investment. We think this is going to be a continuing problem for the Putin-Medvedev regime. Yes, they sort of squashed this group out of Chechnya, and specifically the capital, with a strong sort of crackdown regime, successive regimes, the Kadyrov's father and son. But a classic outcome here when you don't do the winning of hearts and minds with economic development, what you end up with is a multiplied enemy and a geographic spreading of that enemy. So they're becoming much more ambitious. The insurgents targeting ever more northward raises huge issues. You have the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi right next door, not much north of that area. And then, of course, you have the 2018 World Cups games in Moscow, where a lot of these attacks are occurring over the past several years. So the security business, big time, going to expand in Moscow, the major cities, Russia in general, and we would look for a lot of innovation and a certain learning curve that the West should pay attention to, because we think these sorts of attacks are going to be replicated in the West eventually by copycat groups. One of the obvious strategic developments that we're tracking this last couple of weeks, the contagion spread, alleged or real, from North Africa and specifically from Egypt, the seminal events there, to regimes like Syria, Jordan, Yemen. We're watching and tracking a lot of copycatting sort of behavior there in terms of what we call the frantic firewalling impulse. You have Syria promising reforms. You have Jordan, King Abdullah sacking his entire cabinet, bringing out a retread prime minister, recommitting himself to reforms. Yemen, the closest comparison. Saleh promises not to run, longtime ruler there, in the 2013 election, and promises to reopen unity government talks with the opposition. All these attempts have been made in the past, all these promises have been made in the past, and in every instance they've all been backtracked, so this may be just a tremendous show. Wikistrat likes to point out we saw this kind of wave of firewalling in 2005 when events started to unfold and degrade inside Iraq in terms of the civil strife. This time, though, it's different. The brain drain can't be siphoned off to the West in the same degree because the West is just not as welcoming given its economic situation. Plus, you have the East's rise creating all sorts of inflationary pressures. So this revolution, the symbol here, the grad who can't find the job, we see in these three instances, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, lots of efforts to provide government jobs. This is a band-aid, but we think that's the best they could do because Asian foreign direct investment, by and large, is going to continue to bypass the Middle East and look for more stable opportunities, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. The last big strategic development we're tracking in this week's CoreGap report is the go-out strategy of Asian banking. Not just Chinese banking, but also Indian banking, which tends to share the characteristic of Chinese banking in that a lot of state-run or state-dominated banks dominate that industry domestically. And now they're looking to move out and establish retail networks across gap or developing regions and look, in the case of the Chinese, armed with all those reserves, to bottom feed on distressed banks in the West. This is a natural kind of development. All that savings that's been going on in Asia for the last 25, 30 years needs to come back to the West and reinvigorate it, needs to continue developing the gap, needs to be invested in the West in something besides sovereign debt. So we're going to see a lot of activity coming out of this sector. The good news is everybody needs this kind of influx, this kind of backflow from the Asian savings pool. And it's going to go especially, according to the Chinese and the Indians themselves, into Southeast Asia and into Africa. So it's a very good time to be an African banker, we would argue. Asia's bond market is going to explode over the next 15, 20 years because there's going to be all that development, all that urbanization. They're going to put 1 billion people into cities, so they're going to have to float a lot of debt. The big concern here is the transparency issue because of the state domination by those banks, India and China. The share of bond offerings from Asia, only 5% in terms of the globe total, as recently as a decade ago, now 25%. So if you want to talk about a future global financial crisis, there's a good bet that at some point we're going to find something wrong in that system over there, and we're going to see a strong correction.